and change makers from across the world. My name is Aisha Srivastava, and it is my pleasure to serve you as your MC for this morning plenary session. The urgency for transformative action has never been clearer. The first global stocktake shows that global emission must fall by 43% by 2030 to stay within the temperature goals. Meanwhile, only 35% of SDG targets are on track, with many slowing and some reversing. Incremental change is no longer sufficient. The interconnected challenges of climate development, equity, and reliance demand systematic shift, long-term vision, and leadership that can deliver transformative at scale. At the heart of this transformation lies climate finance. India alone requires 2.3 trillion US dollars by 2030 to meet these climate commitments. Adaptation needs are rising rapidly as climate risks intensify, and without scaled and accessible finance, the cost of inaction will far exceed the cost of transition. Climate finance is therefore not simply about capital flows. It is about enabling reliance, protecting development gains, and ensuring a just transition. This session will examine how climate finance can strengthen climate action, particularly for adaptation and reliance. It will explore the transformation needed to enable effective, adequate finance flows, especially for developing countries and communities. Some safety announcement before we begin. We are gathered this morning at the Taj Palace in Durbar Hall located at the ground level of the building. The hall has 4 exit doors, 2 exit doors at the front side leading to the assembly area, Raja Bagh and Rani Bagh, through the banquet glass doors. 2 fire exits at the back side of the dais leading to the staff gate through service corridors. There is no mock drill planned for today. All hotel associates are trained to handle emergency situation. In the case of an emergency, we request you to remain calm and follow their instructions. Before we proceed, I want to take a moment to share something powerful. This year, in partnership with Cool the Globe, we can all take a real climate action right here, right now. Download the Cool the Globe app, join WSDS community, and complete simple sustainable tasks during the summit. The top 10 participants on the leaderboard will be recognized as our most sustainable delegates. Let us truly walk the talk together. And moving ahead, we have a distinguished lineup of global experts for this important session on the climate finance imperative. It is my pleasure to introduce and invite on the stage our moderator for the session, Ms. Leena Nandan, former Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest, Climate Change, Government of India. Also, I would like to invite our esteemed panelist, Ms. Falk Roser, founder, Managing Director, New Climate Institute, Mr. Amit Purohit, Director General, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, Professor Anand Patwardhan, School of Public Policy, University of Maryland, Dr. Anupurna, Sustainable Development Practitioner, Dr. Sujata Gupta, Asian Development Bank, Ms. Valerie Hickey, Group Global Director for Environment, the World Bank, Ms. Kanmani Chokalingam, Senior Fellow, Michelangelo Global Institute, Mr. Deepak Deshgupta, Distinguished Fellow, Terry, and Professor Bento Miller, Managing Director, Oxford Climate Policy. May I request the speakers and chair for a group photo, please? Thank you, everyone. With that, may I now request Ms. Leena Nandan to take the session forward. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Good morning to all the participants, to all the distinguished dignitaries on the dais, and to all our audience members who've joined online. I think this theme of the climate finance imperative is something that makes sure that all of us want to know what is it that is happening and what is it that can unfold in the decades to come. In fact, the decades is too long a time frame if we look at the urgency of the climate crisis. For too long, we have talked about the ramifications of climate change, the burden of historical responsibility, the quantum of funds needed, and the urgency of action. But it is now, the here and now, that action is needed. And we have to have short-term strategies in place if we are to make a visible change, if we are to safeguard the planet for the future generations. And that is why this dialogue, this discussion, comes at a very meaningful and relevant time. How can we factor in climate investment decisions, taking into account risk allocation? How can we make sure that communities and societies that are doing their best, that are taking ownership of the problem and actually coming out with innovations, these innovations are being mainstreamed and scaled up? How do we ensure that our future plans are really futuristic, taking into account new technologies, new innovations, and supporting the inherent risks that are there in the supply chain? So these are some of the issues that I think are concerning all of us. But today's panel, with its very distinguished lineup, with participants that are across the spectrum, I think will offer us very new insights, concepts, and ideas, which will enrich our thoughts and give us more specific pathways for going forward. So I will start by inviting Mr. Deepak Dasgupta, Distinguished Fellow Terry, to share his thoughts, and then we will continue with the panelists. I will request them to share their ideas, their views, their suggestions. After that, we would open it up for audience questions, and then, time permitting, wrap-up comments from our panelists. I assure you that each of us has come up with very specific ideas and thoughts that we want to share with this distinguished group here and all of those who have joined online. And I'm sure that we will have a very fruitful and meaningful discussion. Over to you, Mr. Dasgupta.
Thank you. Shall I just go there?
I think then you will have two mics.
Let me see.
It's working.
It works.
I have two mics, so if you hear me twice,
Oh, there's
you know.
double impact.
You know, a few things in three parts, climate finance in three parts. First part is estimated annual global climate finance flows as last year, as best as we can tell, was around $2.5 trillion. That's the actual amount of finance that's flowing to climate and climate related. And AI, which is attracting so much attention around the world, has a funding of around estimated $300 billion. So good news for us. Climate finance is actually bigger than what's flowing into AI by a factor of about 10 times. So second news, for us in developing countries, the challenge is much bigger because the flows of finance coming to developing countries are anywhere around 120. This is flows, cross-border flows of around $120 billion. And the size that we need, cross-border flows, are much bigger. But these numbers don't tell us the full story. There's climate financing investments happening, 85% of which is financed by the countries themselves in one fashion or another. So that's very big. So the critical choice for us is, how do you get much more action at the cross-border level of finance flows from MDBs, from the private finance for both adaptation, mitigation. The challenge is to make these cross-border flows rise dramatically. And the reason it needs to rise is the biggest and most highest return investments, whether it is in adaptation or whether it is in mitigation, is actually in developing countries. The costs of getting climate transition done most efficiently, if I were a banker sitting globally, where would I put my money in? I would for sure put my money in that energy transitions and the climate resilient development in developing countries. So there are some questions about how to make this happen. And that's the third part, and I'll conclude there. The question that we're now facing at COP30, we had this huge discussion about how to make the needle move on both adaptation finance, which is going to be tripled is the commitment. And we had a commitment also to try and raise the volume of annual funding cross-border to about 1.3 billion. We actually settled at about 300 billion. Underneath that COP30 discussion, we also had something which is call to action, implementation. So we're no longer worried only about commitments at a global level. And one of the challenges there that we're trying to meet is how do you get bankable, quote unquote, bankable projects going. And in that respect, we are starting a subnational activity in India, very big. First time we're going to do a subnational cross states for something like 14 states in eastern India, the home of the coal mining areas. And we expect we will see accelerated subnational actions taking place across India. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for, in fact, pointing out that it is cold comfort that climate finance is somewhat better than finance in AI. So we'll hold that thought for the moment. I'll ask Professor Benito Mueller he's the managing director of Oxford Climate Policy, renowned think tank. So over to you, Professor Mueller.
Thank you very much. Exactly 20 years ago, we proposed an international air passenger adaptation levy based on the French solidarity levy for HIV/AIDS, UNITAID, and all that. In Poznan at the COP, it was even submitted by the LDCs, but it didn't fly, pun intended, okay? And I sort of got a little bit disheartened and I let it go. I said, forget that one for a laugh. And then 2 years ago, my dear late friend Salimul Haq came up to me and said, let's revive it for loss and damage, okay? And I sort of, yeah, okay, but let's maybe do something else. The model of the French solidarity levy was countries getting together voluntarily and helping each other without a multilateral agreement or anything. And I thought, why don't we try that? Create the Climate Solidarity Alliance for adaptation and loss and damage. The point is, this can be done without the whole sort of apparatus of having to get a multilateral treaty. And it can be done now. It's not going to raise trillions. The French levy, still running below the radar, raises around 500 million annually. And we can get more, and it just depends how many countries participate. And so, to me, the main thing is we need the goals, we need the roadmaps and all that, but we also need something to happen now on the ground, which is visible, to show that it actually matters, solidarity matters, okay? And so that's what I'm working on right now, trying to get this up and running. And we have been sort of in touch with Brazil, because it also involves, you can do South-South, not just, the usual sort of thing, and the French are working with. So let's see. I think, particularly in the context of loss and damage, and then I'll stop, is fundamentally different from mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation and adaptation, you have a choice. It may not be wise not to do it, but you have a choice. Loss and damage, you have no choice. And it's a matter of civil protection where the buck stops with the government, right? It doesn't go to the international community. So governments have to realize, oops, this is happening now. It is not in the future. It's happening now, and we need to be prepared. And that's the main sort of message of this alliance too, that we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Müller. I think solidarity is what we really are looking for, what we really need urgently, because we can keep talking till the cows come home about a multilateral agreement on many issues that are issues more of difference than of commonality. But I think I would somewhat differ from you on the point about the choice on adaptation. I think India is one of the countries that does not have a choice on adaptation because the urgency is in the here and now. We are facing problems of vulnerability of our infrastructure, of the lives and livelihoods of people, whether in coastal areas or on the hills and mountains of the country. We are facing problems of adaptation in terms of our food and water security. So really that is where the action is urgently needed, and how that connects with the finance flows that we expect is the question that is concerning all of us, even while we move to looking at more and more funds coming in into the mitigation-centric projects. But I will move now to Ms. Kanmani Chokalingam from the McKinsey, and I think she will be able to give us a perspective on in terms of investment attitudes of the private sector. And I say attitude because that is what determines the decisions and the choices.
Thank you. So I think all of us agree that climate adaptation is necessary. It's widely endorsed. It's cost effective, but it's chronically underfunded. And we at the McKinsey Global Institute studied this in a recent research report that we published. And I'll talk through each of these specific claims that I made very quickly. So climate adaptation is necessary. A lot of the world is already exposed to climate hazards. We find that about 40% of the world's land mass is exposed to at least one of heat, wildfire, drought, or flooding. And that affects about 4 billion people every year. And of the 4 billion people, about 1 billion people are today protected against climate hazards from adaptation. India particularly, which is essentially has a large population and diverse climate, has where 80% of India's landmass is affected by at least one of these climate hazards, and 90% of India's population is exposed to these climate hazards today. So, and climate adaptation, therefore, is necessary today. And going forward, under current emissions trajectories, the world is expected to warm to about 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2030, and about 2 degrees Celsius by about 2050, making climate hazards more widespread, more intense, and more numerous. A place that faces one hazard today could face much more, 2 to 3 hazards, for example. So climate adaptation becomes extremely essential in that sense. The second, which is climate adaptation, is widely endorsed. As all of you know, the COP30 was dubbed the adaptation COP. Many countries have started developing national adaptation plans. Some form of formal adaptation plans exist for about 140 countries today, up from about 80 countries 5 years ago. And companies are also thinking about climate adaptation more and more, both financial services companies as well as real economy companies, and not only from the point of view of risk avoidance, but also from the point of view of opportunities and what opportunities they can capture in the adaptation space going forward. So it's widely endorsed. But it is also cost effective. We looked at 20 widely used common adaptation measures, from active cooling solutions like air conditioning, passive cooling like cool roofs, stormwater networks, sea dikes, irrigation, and found that the benefits to cost ratio of adaptation is about 3 to 1. And what do I mean by benefits to cost ratio? It is the damages avoided by adaptation exceeds the cost of adaptation by 3 times. And that is in today's climate. As temperatures increase and hazards become more intense, of longer duration, and become more severe, the benefits to cost ratio will only increase and it will become 7:1. These are societal benefits. And my panelists will tell you later on that societal benefits are not essentially the only consideration when it comes to financing adaptation. And we'll come to that. But it's cost effective. So what's the catch? Why is it not happening right now? So the reason that it's not, there are two reasons that it's not happening right now. So we find that the total cost of adaptation by 2050 would need to be in the ballpark of $1.2 trillion annually globally. In India, this would exceed like $200 billion annually. So why is it not, so what's the catch? The catch is that the $1.2 trillion might sound big, but it's less than 1% of global GDP in 2050. But then in lower income places like sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, that would translate to about 3% of GDP. In India and other emerging nations, it'll be about 1.5 to 2% of GDP. In India, for example, it's like $125 per person in today's dollars. That's more than a third of India's central government adaptation budget, central government budget overall in the last year. So that's a big lift for emerging economies. The second is, even though adaptation is cost effective, it's not necessarily financially viable yet. It's cost effective from the point of view of societal benefits, and that is evident in the fact that today the world spends, and this is spends and not flows, the world spends about $190 billion on climate adaptation right now. That $190 billion protects the 1 billion people out of 4 billion people who are exposed to climate hazards. That's only about a third of what's needed to be spent to protect everybody exposed to climate hazards. Right? So even today, even when adaptation is cost effective, only a third is being spent. So clearly there are reasons why adaptation spending does not happen. One is spending priorities. Adaptation is one of many spending priorities, particularly in low-income places. And second, more important, is adaptation is a cost avoidance business case. So the benefits of adaptation come when a house is not washed away or workers have productivity preserved. It does not, there's no revenue stream associated with it, and this makes it very hard to finance adaptation. So what this says is that it's not only about the supply of financing, but also demand levers need to be unlocked for financing to happen, go towards adaptation. And I'll talk about very quickly about 5 things that can be done. One is improving understanding of adaptation. Unlike mitigation, a lot of adaptation is within private control, implementing active cooling measures, implementing irrigation, for example. And so improving understanding of risks and the benefits of adaptation will help in making this happen. Then the 4 other things are essentially aligning incentives better for implementers, aligning, making adaptation more affordable, and this is where grant financing and public financing can come into play. And companies can also play a role here in innovating to make more solutions more cost effective. And finally, implementing well. While building infrastructure right now, ensuring that adaptation is already embedded in it, not building in places of high risk, for example, are examples of this. And finally, mobilizing and innovating on capital towards adaptation is another big lever to pull.
Thank you, Kanmani. I think that was quite illuminating, and some of it will be music to the ears of Amit, because it seems to be addressing concerns of disaster resilience and vulnerability, and I'm sure you will take her up separately to find out how that can happen. But I would also like to leave a thought with you, Kanmani, as McKinsey is one of the leading players across the world in terms of consulting, in terms of guiding companies and making business case for them. There has to be some development of a matrix for embedding climate into investment decisions. So investments that have a negative impact and those which are also positive, somehow the weightages have to be incorporated, avoided losses have to be incorporated. It is difficult, but I would say not impossible. So that is a thought that I would like to leave with you. I will now ask our 4th speaker, Ms. Frauke Rauser, founder and managing director of New Climate Institute, for her thoughts.
Thank you very much, and good morning to the audience. First of all, thank you for having me here on this panel. Happy to share some rather more general thoughts on adaptation finance. I leave the numbers to the bankers around me. I think I just wanted to start, and I have to start by stating the obvious again. I think it is absolutely important to scale adaptation finance, in particular for vulnerable communities, in an accelerating climate crisis that we're seeing already today. I think the public sector, and we will talk a lot about private, plays an important role for adaptation and adaptation finance at the national level in terms of planning, setting policies, creating the enabling environment for investors, and also internationally, for climate finance. And we see that flows are not nowhere near enough, although numbers are increasing. No, they consistently fall short of what is actually needed, and also at times what has been agreed internationally. And I think we need to acknowledge that historic emitters do have the responsibility to pay their fair share of climate finance and adaptation finance. At the same time, we know the political realities internationally. The geopolitical environment is difficult. Also, the political discourse in many countries, including my own, on climate finance, on climate change in general, is rather, let's say, complicated. So I don't think we can realistically expect the public finance to flow actually at the levels that we would want to see, perhaps, that would maybe be fair to see. That are actually needed. So I mean, the private sector, of course, needs to come in, but I think we also need to be very careful and effective and efficient on where and how we use the scarce public finance that is available. And I just wanted to share 3 kind of thoughts on that. I think, first of all, I think it's important to view adaptation not in a silo. It's part of a triple challenge that countries are facing, which is mitigation, adaptation, and development. We need to continue to decarbonize fast. If we delay action on mitigation, it will only increase the cost of adaptation, and then, of course, lead to higher losses and damages, let alone the human suffering that comes along with that, and obviously overarching the development goals and eliminating poverty and reducing inequalities in the world. So it's not a silo issue, it's rather a systemic challenge that we're facing, and I think we also need to then have a more systemic response to it. And I think, let's say, transition pathways and transition planning that kind of think the 3 dimensions together, that to understand synergies between the areas, but also trade-offs that we have to manage and that we will be facing, I think will be important. Understand where the investments are needed, where finance needs to flow, at what scale, where the public comes in, etc. And I think one other area that is important is not only the mobilization of new finance or mobilization of finance, but the misalignment. Yeah, there's still a lot of investment going into areas that actually reduces adaptive capacities, so into maladaptation, and looking at these finance flows and shifting those, I think, is actually a great source of finance as well. And then lastly, I think we need to continue the discussion on, it's not even new sources, but yeah, I guess new sources and ways to free up public budgets. The aviation levy was mentioned. There are also the discussions at the IMO level, shipping taxes, but taxes and levies in general. I think we need to continue the discussions on debt reform to free up fiscal space for countries that are spending a lot of their public budgets on servicing debt rather than investing in resilient infrastructure and the likes. I think we need to continue the discussion on subsidy reforms that are at scales that are also mind-blowing. I mean, and many cases socially, of course, relevant, but I think phasing out fossil fuel subsidies is an important source as well. And then lastly, yeah, the good old polluter pays principle. Yeah, I think we can reactivate that, and I just find it astonishing that we have polluters, and not only at the country level. No, I'm also talking at the industry level, the oil and gas industry that rakes in profits in the order of 3 billion a day. And is not held accountable. And I think kind of their ideas around that, windfall taxes, no, that have actually been used in some countries. And I think we need to kind of continue the discussion on that to actually achieve the scales of finance that we need to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Frauke. I think you have flagged two very relevant issues. When transition is talked about, there's also the supply chain disruption that happens. So how does the financing take care of it? Because one is not possible without the other. And the second thing you highlighted was debt servicing, and that has actually become the major bottleneck, the major constraint. And these are issues that can be talked about, but they need to be fleshed out and actually acted upon. So we will hold that thought. I now move to Ms. Sujata, Dr. Sujata Gupta from the ADB. And it's, as a multilateral development bank, there is a lot that has been done and which is expected to unfold. And we hope Sujata will share her thoughts and leave us with some more optimism and positivity as she concludes her comments. Thank you, Sujata. Over to you.
Thank you. Am I audible? Okay. So thank you, Leena ji, and for giving me this very onerous task. I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers for inviting the Asian Development Bank to be part of this very esteemed and prestigious panel. It's an honor for me to be here. So I would be somewhat repeating what the previous speakers have said, but taking a very practical approach to it. So we find that climate finance for adaptation is very challenging. And I would broadly say two main reasons. One, we have not been able to create a market for it, as we were able to do for mitigation finance. And the second reason is the very high rate of discount on an uncertain, very distant future event. So as a result of this, investments are not going into this space. So ADB, as a development financial institution, is addressing some of these issues. However, our resources are very limited. So we are looking at ways how we can leverage these limited resources to deliver the maximum benefit. Now, what you're going to hear after this is going to sound like a sales pitch for ADB, but please forgive me for that. So I'll elaborate how ADB is mobilizing grant and public finance to towards bridging this gap in adaptation financing. Now, in Asia, developing member countries are already facing the impacts of climate shocks, and this is impacting livelihoods. This is impacting food, water availability, as well as health. And the poor and vulnerable are disproportionately impacted by this. Now, again, previous speakers mentioned that the priority becomes more the immediate needs. And that's why I spoke about, the uncertainty in the future and the discount rates and limited resources. So what ADB is trying to do is mainstream climate resilient development outcomes in our regular operations, and to drive away financial flows from what we call potentially maladaptive activities. So the focus is on sustainability and mainstreaming of these investments. And we try to do this through our interventions. How do we do it? One is ADB's own resources. And in this area, we have created a special grant window. It's an additional grants window where we have allocated 440 million between 2025 to 2028. And through this window, we are supporting Marshall Islands and Fiji on coastal resilience projects. We are looking at climate-related water scarcity in the Kyrgyz Republic and early warning systems in Mongolia. So I'll be giving some numbers, but that's what I was told is expected of bankers. For the SIDS, we have established more concessional lending terms, partly to incentivize investments in resilient or incentivize resilient investments. Then we use our resources in a strategic manner to unlock further financing. So here an example is where in Pakistan we have issued domestic green sukuk or Islamic bonds, and we have established a solidarity fund which can look at risk transfer solutions in such as agriculture insurance. Then we also try to work with governments to have policy reforms and look at capacity building, planning, strengthen the planning in the systems. But again, this is will take some time to show, to manifest, but things like adaptation measures in agriculture has a very strong uptake in amongst the government. So we are trying to see how we can catalyze investments in climate resilient agriculture. The second way ADB, or I'm sure all MDBs work, is to help the developing countries access concessional adaptation finance from global funds. So here we have, just as an example, a Glacier to Farms program, which is helping Central and West Asia to access around 250 million of concessional financing from the Green Climate Fund. And this is helping countries to look at increasing risks from glacial melt and look at investments in water and food security. The third instrument is what we call our technical assistance. This is very catalytic. It's a very small amount, but we work with our partners, our clients, and we help them to develop adaptation investment plans. And an example of this is, translating the national adaptation plans into investment plans. So we are identifying and developing project pipelines. And when I say project pipelines, these have to be viable, bankable project pipelines. And we are working in 14 countries, of course in Asia, but in South Asia, it includes Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And again, these pipelines would have investments or has potential for investment from the private sector. So I won't go into innovative financing mechanisms at this point, but we can look at blended financing structures and sustainability-linked financing. But let me stop here. I think I've exceeded my time with my sales pitch.
Think your sales pitch was quite effective. We'll all be queuing up at the doors of ADB at this rate. And I'm also happy to learn about the bankability of adaptation projects that you spoke about. And perhaps I can also make a sales pitch. There's a wonderful exhibition here called Him Connect. It's about a lot of research projects that have been done, and one of them particularly came to mind when you talked about, glacial melt. So it predicts landslides, one of the models that has been showcased. Why I am exhorting this panel to take a look at that exhibition and interact with the investigators is because this is some excellent ground-based research work which has also been validated to some extent. But until we get financing, until we are able to support project proponents, these innovations will remain exactly what they are, documented and left on the shelves of dusty cupboards. So we have to bring them to reality, we have to bring them to scale. And that, I think, is also a challenge that ADB should set out for itself. Our next speaker is Professor Anand Patwardhan from the School of Public Policy, University of Maryland. And I do hope that we will hear from you what you think public policy should aim for as it grapples with the issues of climate change.
Thanks very much for this, and also thanks to Terry for this invitation to the WSDS, which I think has become quite a singular and unique platform for Southern perspectives. And of course, it's an honor to join this distinguished panel. As the chair said, I'm an academic, and so in that tradition, I hope I will be able to provoke and challenge, but then maybe also provide some ideas. So I'd like to start with sort of 3 quick context-setting observations. As others have said, climate resilience is not a problem of 2050. It's a problem of the here and now, because climate impacts are already manifesting. And I think we have adequate evidence to support that. Keep 1.5 alive may still be legitimate as an aspirational goal. It's not questioning that. But the reality is that there is a rather high likelihood that we will face a 2.5 degree world. We often say that every fraction of a degree matters, but unfortunately, we have done very little in practice to figure out what exactly that means for response, not just for risks. What do we need to do or invest in today that will create the flexibility and continued ability to respond in a 2.5 degree world? What if the nutritional quality, not just the yield, but the nutritional quality of basic staples falls? We might need basic R&D, but basic R&D and outputs from basic R&D have long lead times. Investments will need to be made today. Similarly, given the projected build out over the next 2 decades of long-lived infrastructure, there is a closing window of opportunity, not just for decarbonizing it, but also for ensuring its resilience. Third, the landscape of development finance is changing and in ways that are likely structural and long-term. This had started happening even before the dismantling of USAID, but has only accelerated since. What this means is that in practice, traditional multilateral climate finance and public finance more generally is going to be scarce. So given this situation, it's not surprising that the adaptation finance gap is growing. As the 2025 adaptation gap report pointed out, the adaptation finance gap is now in the range of $300 billion per year until 2035, with needs that are 12 to 14 times as much as current finance flows. So these observations paint a somewhat sobering backdrop, but what is the way forward? I'd like to offer 3 suggestions that maybe also address some of the questions posed to this panel. First, I think we need to focus on the investment case for adaptation. I appreciate what Kamini said, that good economics does not automatically imply flows of finance. There is ample evidence that adaptation actions generate significantly positive returns of investment. She talked about benefit cost ratios. For example, in the report of the Global Commission on Adaptation, we found similar ranges of benefit cost ratios from 9:1 for things like early warning systems to 5:1 for mangrove protection. These triple dividends, as we call them, or benefits of adaptation, include, of course, avoided damages, so future losses, the first dividend, social and economic co-benefits, and then induced economic benefits because we have reduced risk and improved productivity. The problem from a financing perspective is that these benefit streams are contingent and uncertain. So, for example, reduced damages. They could be non-monetary, like social co-benefits, or they could be very hard to monetize, like induced economic growth. And so it's very difficult to convert them into revenue streams that will reflect a return on investment. But this is not a situation unique to adaptation. For example, in energy efficiency, we have options like utility financing or energy service companies that perform this intermediation function of converting future energy savings into the capital investment needed today. So what we will need in the case of adaptation is we will need to look for leveraging existing entities, whether it's a public water utility that can monetize savings from water use efficiency or better stormwater management, or an insurance company that can incentivize risk reduction by capturing future premium savings. Second, we need to focus on the relatively low cost actions, and there are many. I'm very happy that our chair mentioned public policy because the general perception is that adaptation is very costly. This is very true, but this is both true and false, right? So it is true because it's more costly than we think it might be, especially with higher levels of warming. But at the same time, there's actually a lot that can be done at relatively low cost. For example, one of the most effective ways of reducing risk due to flooding or coastal storms is by actually reducing exposure, which can happen by integrating climate risk into land use and development planning. Abandonment instead of protection. Building codes and land use planning can reduce wildfire risk. All of these actions require investment, but even more important, they require understanding and political will. Third, I think we need to focus on the financing of adaptation rather than adaptation finance. This may just seem semantics, but it emphasizes the fact that in practice, we will need to finance adaptation through a mix of public and private sources, recognizing that adaptation generates both public and private benefits. Multilateral adaptation finance is needed, but will never be sufficient. The general misconception is that there is no private investment in adaptation. But private actors are already spending money to reduce their risk to the extent that they can. When a ground floor apartment dweller in Mumbai raises their toilet to reduce the risk of wastewater backing up during heavy rains, that is adaptation. But unfortunately, there's only so much that an individual action can do. Its effectiveness is constrained by what the larger system in which it is embedded. And changing that requires public money and public action. So recognizing, I think, going forward, this duality of adaptation, that it is about private benefits and public benefits, maybe can help unlocking the flows of finance that we need to build resilience and thrive. Thanks.
Thank you, Anand. I think you made a very lucid and cogent argument about public policy and examples of it. And I'm sure your students must love attending your classes. So we will now move, although it was a bit gloomy to hear about us exceeding the 2-degree temperature mark. So I think we need some positive and optimistic scenarios also unfolding. And Sujata has already had the first mover advantage. So Ms. Valerie Hickey has a task cut out for her from the World Bank. She's Group Global Director, and I'm sure you will make an even more compelling argument in favor of the World Bank. Please.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and good morning, everybody, and a huge congratulations to Terry on its 25th anniversary of what has become, as Anand said, such a wonderful platform to discuss sustainable development. And I'm so glad that Sujata went ahead of me, because you have a sense of what multilateral development banks already do. And us as sister banks, we try increasingly to do this more and more together. But when I came in from the airport this morning at 2 a.m. and the streets were thankfully relatively calm because I was in a hurry to get to bed, as you can imagine, I saw a billboard where His Excellency Prime Minister Modi had a slogan for the AI summit that was here, I believe, several weeks back, and it was, "Where innovation meets opportunity." And I thought, that's the slogan we need for adaptation. Because for the past how many decades, we've talked about adaptation as a defensive agenda. This is about avoiding costs in the future, avoiding losses in the future. But it's the wrong way of thinking about this. Adaptation is an opportunity agenda. It's a growth agenda. It's a competitiveness agenda. Think about the small and medium-sized enterprises here in India who do not have access to cooling options. For every 1 degree increase in heat, they have almost a 7% decrease in productivity. You can't be competitive in a global environment where every time the weather gets a little bit warmer, you're losing 7% of your productivity. So this is an opportunity agenda, it's a growth agenda, it's a development agenda. And that's why, as the World Bank, we believe it is an integral part of what we do. Because our mission is to end poverty, and there's never going to be a world without poverty in a world without adaptation finance. That's why last fiscal year we invested over $50 billion in development finance that was tagged as climate finance, and 50% of that was for adaptation finance, particularly in the least developing countries, because adaptation is an opportunity agenda, modernization agenda, particularly for the poor. Because the poor are going to lose 20%, the bottom 20% in every country are going to lose 70% more than the top 20%. All of us here, let's be honest, no matter how hot the weather gets, for those of us who live in northern climes, no matter how cold the weather gets, we're going to be fine. We have access to insurance, we have access to cooling or heating infrastructure. We're going to be okay, but the poor are not. And that's why this is a pro-poor agenda, that's why it's a development agenda, and that's where the innovation meets opportunity matters, because we need to do development better and faster. Because the poor are depending on us to do that. And that's why when it comes to adaptation finance, there are 3 tensions we need to resolve. These are critical so we can make a reality what His Excellency was talking about, Prime Minister Modi, make this where innovation meets opportunity. The first tension is around the fact that we're always talking about value, we're never talking about price. Value is what something is worth. And we've heard so many numbers just here this morning, we've read them for years, that an investment of $1 is worth $4 down the road, whether it's an avoided cost or non-monetary economic benefits. But the truth is the world doesn't work on value, it works on price. Because if value is what something is worth, price is what someone is willing to pay for it. And just think about the ministers of finance in emerging markets and developing economies today, 1/4 of whom are ministers of finance in countries where their GDP per capita is less than it was in 2019. Think about that, not to mind the debt servicing that we heard about. So if price is what someone is willing to pay for it, we need to focus on that because there's not a lot of people who have a lot of room to pay for anything, whether it's on the public side or the private side. On the private side, the tension we need to resolve is around the fact that we focus too much on funds when it comes to climate adaptation, not enough around finance. We focus too much on economic benefits. Of course, they matter, but the private sector isn't a charitable endeavor. It's a profit-making endeavor. Profit is not a dirty word, which means it's not about economic returns, it's about financial returns. And we have to be better at showing where those exist in the adaptation agenda. It's not everywhere, but it is in some places. And the final tension that we have to resolve, and I think it's a really important one, particularly among those of us who work in climate and environment, we have to stop talking about the quantity of finance. Because how long is a piece of string? We don't know how much it's going to cost to adapt. We have to spend more time and more energy talking about the quality of adaptation finance. And that means focusing on 2 things. 1, access. Who actually gets adaptation finance? Several people on this esteemed panel talked about agriculture. Sujatha talked about how ADB is making so much progress on climate-smart agriculture. So are we. But agriculture gets less than 2% of climate finance globally. Farmers, particularly the 600 million small farmers, these are family farms who have less than 2 hectares of land, get less than 1% of climate finance. Access matters. We have to put the money where it's needed. But impact matters even more. We need to get more bang for what, as Anand said, is less buck going forward. There is simply less money to go around. So we need to make sure that it matters. It's having an impact. We need to scale up what works, which means we need to know what works. And we need to shut down what isn't working instead of throwing good money after bad. And that means, and I'll finish with this, Madam Moderator, that we cannot think about impact without thinking about data. Data, data, data. And the IT infrastructure to turn that data into decision making. And when it comes to data, it has to be AAA. It has to be accurate. And it has to be accurate within the responsive timescales that the private sector works on, which is quarterly returns, or even the public sector works on, which is 2 to 3 year timeframes. It's no good talking about data that is responsive on decadal timeframes. It doesn't work for decision making. The second thing it has to be when it comes to AAA data is it has to be accessible. It's no good if it's sitting on my computer or sitting, Madam Moderator Lena, on your shelf. It has to be accessible to decision makers. And it has to be put in a way that makes sense. We've become so exclusive in our language on climate finance and climate, most people don't understand what we mean. We have to make it accessible, put it in terms that people understand. And finally, it has to be affordable. We do not want to build climate data architecture that only rich cities, rich countries, rich communities can afford to curate, produce, and have decisions around. So if we have that AAA data, then we can make the decision-making that will bring in the finance, that will turn this into an opportunity agenda. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you, Valerie. I think you made a very important point when you talked about data. I think the Reserve Bank of India has already initiated action towards collecting climate-related climate risk information data. So that is the kind of hard data that we need to gather that determines decisions of investment. You also spoke about affordability of the loans. That is equally important. And finally, I think what I liked the most was the point you made about demystifying a lot of the deliberations and discussions around climate in general and climate finance in particular. Very often I have felt that climate itself is something that has been taken to the outer space in terms of being understood and relatable. And if we want the farmer, for instance, to be able to take the right choices, then how do we translate what is happening in the present and what is likely to happen in the future, unless it is relatable and acceptable? And then we also have the solutions for the problems that we are posing to the farmer or to the small entrepreneur or to the urban local body. So a lot of it is not just data gathering and analysis, but it's also translating it into simple communication and actionable points. I will now turn to our next speaker, Dr. Annapurna Vancheshwaran, who has a lifetime of experience in sustainable development, former TERI and the Nature Conservancy expert. And we would like to hear from you from the context of not just the community, but also the private sector.
Thank you, Leena ji. Let me also thank first Vibha and Shelly Kedia for letting me be part of this momentous journey of 25 years of the WSDS. And some of you may know, many of you may know, but some of you may know that for 20 years, this has been, I used to wake up with WSDS and sleep for WSDS the whole year. So it's been the 21st summit. Thank you very much. Having said that, I think it resonates so much what you spoke just now from the World Bank. Clearly, when we are talking about climate, and Ambassador Dasgupta, you talked about the $3 trillion that is required for climate change. But I think there is a need for us to also look at what will be the cost of inaction. If we are talking about $3 billion for action, what's the cost of inaction? Having said that, let me get to ground zero, where I would be giving you just two examples of how the private sector could move things, but in a collaborative manner, which is very important to know that there are answers to the problems that we are seeking the responses to. There are, but we need to look at it with a positive lens, and that's what you brought in when you were speaking there. The private sector, we accept and we know that they can play a catalytic role. And yesterday in the session where I think Mr. Zelke, if I'm pronouncing him right, in the Himalayan Coalition plenary session, talked about the Montreal Protocol, which India also signed because we had to sign the Montreal Protocol. And of course, I was very happy to see that he had noticed Paul Crutzen, Sherwood Rowland, and Dr. Ramanathan were present on this stage at WSDS sometime or the other. But having said that, he brought out the issue of super climate pollutants, which is not carbon dioxide, but and the NOxes and the SOxes, but the methanes and the CFCs and HFCs. It reminded me of the work that was undertaken in India, and that was in the early 90s. And at that time, Leena ji, the ministry was the Ministry of Environment and Forests, MOEF, and climate change was not part of that. And Terry had been involved in this. It was, we were involved, Terry was involved in engaging the industry in the phase out of the CFCs. So we had the air conditioning industry, the refrigeration industry, and the the sectors that we couldn't reach out to, which is the aerosols and the solvents. However, through a dedicated group of the ministries, the agenda, the local NGOs that got together and the industry, the phase out was pretty marvelous. And we must applaud the industries to have done that. And we seem to be at a very high level of refrigeration and air condition where we moved out from the CFCs. Again, this was the first example that came into my mind when I was looking at what have we done. In the plenary session on green manufacturing, we talked about now green steel. Now, I just wanted to know, and here Dr. Sujata Gupta has been part of it. Terry took a seminal study on looking at our natural resource use since our independence, which is 1947 to 1997, but we started the study in 1995, which was called the Green India 2047. GREEN is an acronym, which is Growth with Resource Enhancement of Environment and Nature. I wouldn't get into the study, it was a very big study, and Sujata knows, and she had detailed it out, which was we looked at air, water, soil, land, forest, biodiversity. But having said that, among the several recommendations that came out from this seminal study, there was one on the cement sector. And it had much to do with regard to its efficiency and highly polluting nature. And mind you, they were partners to this study. And while one would not directly attribute the current status of cement sector to the study, but we can proudly mention that the Indian cement sector now is considered a global leader in energy efficiency. As the world's second largest producer, the industry operates some of the most energy efficient plant globally. So there are pockets of excellence where there is an opportunity. And there is a lot more to say, but I would like an opportunity for everyone to get together on a discussion and end with, if there is a will, we find the means. And I think I will end here.
Thank you, Annapurna ji. I think you flagged a very important aspect of what had not been discussed, because we have focused on the financing aspect. When you brought in specific examples of the Montreal Protocol, where India has done exceptionally well in terms of the targets for phase down and phase out of various coolants. And also you referred to the study on cement, and I think this is an opportune moment to mention that the carbon credit trading system, which has been put into place in India, in fact, it envisages reduction of carbon emissions by industries, and the first set of obligations was notified on the cement sector. That was done last year. Why I'm mentioning this is because when we talk about finance, there are also non-financial market-based interventions that can actually also bring about the difference. And CCTS is one example. Also the extended producer responsibility framework that has been introduced by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And in fact, the first set of rules was notified in 22. That was just after I joined the ministry. And in the last 3 years, I think this system of waste management being brought into the sphere of obligation and compliance has actually resulted in a huge amount of recycling happening in the country. So over a period of 4 years, 414 lakh metric ton has been recycled of waste. And there are obligations to reuse this waste material in the forthcoming production value chain. So these are also examples of how Finance through market intervention, which in turn is nudged through the policy regime, can bring about a difference to the whole climate crisis as we see it today. I would now like to turn to our last speaker of the session before we open it up to the audience, and why it is important to hear him last among all the panelists, because he is Mr. Amit Prothi. He is the DG for the Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and we've all talked about adaptation and finance and vulnerability. So it is extremely important for us to hear from him the challenges as he sees it, the need for finance, and perhaps something encouraging on the finance aspect itself. Over to you, Dr. Prothi.
Thank you, Secretary Nandan, and all the esteemed panelists. I mean, it's quite a privilege to be here. I want to congratulate WSDS and Terry for not only 25 years, but continuing a discussion that only becomes more and more important every year, frankly, right? A lot of things have been said, and I want to pick up because I represent an organization that's focused on disaster resilient infrastructure. So I'll start with one number, which is that when we look at infrastructure, the amount of infrastructure we have to build in the next 20 years is what we built over the last 200 years. That is an opportunity for us. The pace of change that's going on in not only our country, but around the world is incredible. And can we make a difference there? That is the opportunity for us. There are investments already going in the infrastructure sector. We talk about Viksit Bharat in India. We talk about funds needed, but funds are going in as well. And the opportunity is, can we shift the narrative where adaptation, mitigation, resilience are not outside of what development is today? Can we actually really talk about development as adaptation, development as mitigation? The evidence is there. I mean, I don't need to repeat, there's lots of numbers there. The question is, how do you do it? So because we sit in the infrastructure space, we're working now across 40 countries, trying to see how we can start to influence those marginal changes that are needed to make a road more resilient to landslides, to make your power sector more resilient to cyclones, to make your telecommunications sector more reducing disruptions when there is a interruption that happens, right? When we talk about adaptation, and a lot of people have already said, it's not tomorrow, it's today. I moved to Delhi back after a long time, 4 years back. And it was dead heat in the summer, and we were enjoying our air conditioning house at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and the bell rings. And my poor guard, I think we live in those elite colonies. My guard comes and red in the face and says, "Sir, can I get some ice?" And I look at it and I felt terrible that here I am talking to the world about adaptation, and here in front of my house is somebody who needs to be immediately protected from the extreme heat conditions that are ongoing. I use that example because it is not tomorrow's problem, it is today's problem. And every action that we are taking, all of us are in a way sitting in a space where we are already investing in something. And when we say adaptation needs that much money, we kind of forget that how do we change that marginal change that we need to bring to do adaptation today. So, we spent a lot of time with governments mostly for the time being. We worked at the state of Odisha, which faces cyclones quite regularly, to try to get a methodology out there to say, when you're looking at your transmission and distribution system that gets damaged because of cyclonic activity, how do you address it from a financial instrument that makes sense for you? If you look at upgrading the entire coastline, it's going to be X billions of dollars. If you look at where vulnerability exists along those coastline, which distribution system, which transmission system is serving which community, which aspect. So when you start to introduce elements of vulnerability, you start to break down the problem into much more manageable ways of addressing the problem. And now the Asian Development Bank is in discussions with the state of Odisha to say, okay, can we support that? Because we understand how it is bankable, right? So because we work in the infrastructure space, we're spending a fair amount of time trying to unpackage this problem of adaptation and disaster and mitigation and development that are sitting in different boxes. And the frame that I've used, and I'll just talk about it for 30 seconds and then make a pitch for a report that we've published at COP that actually is incredibly rich in a lot of this material, which was done in partnership with the World Bank and others. When you think about a disaster, a cyclone, a flood, a landslide, there are three parts to it from the infrastructure side. How does your infrastructure absorb that shock? So what all do you need to do ahead of time so that when the landslide happens or when the cyclone comes, your infrastructure can absorb it? Retrofitting it, funds to retrofit it, codes and standards, etc. When your infrastructure is damaged, because it will get damaged, you can't avoid all losses. When it gets damaged, how do you make sure it recovers quickly? So for example, we're working with 3 Caribbean islands that get hit quite regularly by cyclones. They don't get hit at the same time. They get hit at different times. And what we are working with them to do is, can they store supplies where if there's a cyclone that hits one island, they can very quickly recover because the supplies are available nearby and the capacity is available nearby. So this ability to quickly recover out of that shock, and then long-term recovery. There's enough evidence that shows that when a disaster happens, the longer it takes to recover, the bigger the impact on your economy. So what can you do? And that's where insurance and that's where other mechanisms can come into place, where you say, I understand my risk, I understand how to absorb it, I can't address all my risk, I understand how to immediately reduce the impact of the disaster, and then I understand how to recover it in the long term. And I've thought about financing from all those perspectives. So this is, we're calling it a risk layering approach, where different instruments are addressing different facets of this challenge. Again, I'll make a pitch. Please go look at our report on our website. We launched it at COP. It's probably one of the most intense work around resilient infrastructure that exists globally. Please do look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. I think it was very interesting to hear you talk about insurance, because when we look at financing, we somehow tend to think that insurance is a separate ball game altogether. So if we can have blended instruments which incorporate insurance as a risk mitigation mechanism, then perhaps our ecosystem for financing will be the richer and the better. I would like to now open up the floor to the audience and ask for a mic to go around so that you can introduce yourself. We will take some 5 questions. So the first question to the gentleman in front, and also a trick question for all the panelists. At the end, just one line. So I've given you enough lead time to think of one line that you would like to leave the audience with. So you can note it down very quickly.
We focused on the first of all, good morning and nice informative sessions. My name is Giri Sethi. I have one point to say. This, besides the reason of the green gases emissions, the fossil fuel, coal, gas, and oil, what do you think on the burning satellites? One need to understand how satellite heating the sky. Thank you.
I would think that this is not addressed to any particular panelists, because it seems to be a scientific question. So burning satellites, how much it has been taken into account by the IPCC in its analysis? Anyone would care to hazard a guess? Otherwise, we will note your point, and we will see how at any subsequent stage we can take it up. Any of us who has an interaction with the IPCC. Yes, please, the gentleman in front. A mic to him, please.
Yeah. Can I ask him?
He has got the mic. Oh, he has the mic.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you can give it to the gentleman here. Yeah.
Should I ask a question?
Yeah, please go
Okay.
ahead.
I'll take 30 seconds to ask my question. My question about to create impact on saving the people lives and reduce their healthcare expenses actually. But based on my experience of the 30 years of R&D, and this is my first time attending TERI programs, we have to connect right door to innovate something or implement. And in country like India, where a lot of finance and human resources are engaged into the industrial and engagement infrastructure. So do you think that country like India, or can be start their government enterprise, or India is cannot start then country like Japan, Germany, Switzerland, where there is a Denmark, there is a lot of fund diversify for sustainability, either through their budget or the climate bond actually. Why I'm asking this question? Because I want to see one of my beneficiary, I'm about to implement my nano air filter or something magic bottle to air pollution and respiratory disease and remove the cancer. So I want to ask this question about implementation part actually, to creating ventures for this climate challenges.
Would you like to take that up from the financing perspective, from the World Bank? Yeah, can you ask very specifically what is it that you wanted to know?
Keep the phone properly.
Very specific to World Bank.
Yeah, there are the innovation, but we have to implement. Implement also required to create the supply chain, and there is a awareness and adoption. So
Okay,
like,
so I think what he wants to talk about is supporting innovations.
So I think the innovation that we need to focus on most is capital coordination, making money work together. For example, public money should not displace private money in implementation. We shouldn't be paying for something with limited private purse, neither the government nor multilaterals, if the private sector will take it up. We need to work together on the same deal sheet. We need to focus on capital coordination if we want implementation to have the impact it can have.
Thank you. A mic there to the gentleman there. Yeah.
Good morning, thank you. Matthias Frumery, Swedish Climate Ambassador. First, just sharing a thought and then a question. When we speak about finance more generally, we like to speak about 3 steps to finance. Firstly, how we as national governments integrate climate action throughout our national budget and planning systems. Secondly, how we as a donor mainstream climate action throughout our development finance, and hopefully also having that as a priority in terms of from our partner countries. And thirdly, and maybe most importantly, how we as countries can secure an attractive investment climate to attract the kind of investment necessary for both mitigation and adaptation purposes. So that's how we try to engage also with partner countries, ensuring that we can mobilize sufficient finance. And then to my question, and I think and many panelists have touched upon this, that how do we sort of unlock that kind of maybe misunderstanding or the misconceptions in terms of what adaptation actually is, to both sort of to speak to a wider audience, but also to speak to investors. And would it maybe be easier if instead of speaking about adaptation, that we spoke about resilient infrastructure and resilient agriculture? And that would also then maybe help for investors to see, how can they make proper risk assessments and climate risk assessments when making investment decisions in terms of railroads, ports, housing, hospitals, schools, and so forth. Thank you.
Maybe Sujata can respond to this.
Sorry, what was the
Investment decisions, how do you actually factor in when you assess projects?
Right. So as I said, we are trying to mainstream this resilience component in all our projects. And it's very, very important that there is ownership. There is an impact, there's an ownership of all the stakeholders in the project that is being designed. So for example, we can't say, okay, we need to have, agriculture is one of the easier sector because you see the impact, say within a year's time. But adaptations, I here slightly disagree with some of the panelists who were saying that, the impacts are now and here, because there are several which are in the distant future. So it's very important to create an ownership in the investments today that ensure risk resilience of the projects and to build this capacity. So, so for example, in ADB, we emphasize a lot on livelihood generation and looking at not only the investment, but how, so we did, for example, somebody spoke about value chains. So we financed a private sector project in Mongolia looking at Kashmir value chains. But at the same time, it gave employment to the herders, it gave employment to those working in the factories, but it also, we did a capacity building for the herders, how to do sustainable agriculture and sustainable pasture management. So my quick response here is it's not an easy problem, but the idea is to create ownership and sustainability in our operations and investments.
I think
So while Amit responds, there's a gentleman there who wants to speak. So if you can just take the mic there, while Amit also adds to this.
Quickly, for the infrastructure sector side, I think what we try to do sometimes is if you're investing in the transportation infrastructure, let's say a metro system or a road, we'll try to highlight why you need to pay attention to climate. For example, now, if you take the word climate out for a second, during COVID, a lot of the metro systems lost ridership. And when they lost ridership, they couldn't pay back their loans. We use that as an example to say when you aggregate all of the disruptions that are going to be happening in your system because of climate change in the lifetime of that system, it adds up to about 6 months to a year and a half of disruption where you're actually going to have an impact on your financial flow. And a lot of companies are already doing it. I'll give you an example. Toyota in April 2022 in South Africa, their factory got flooded. They lost 68,000 vehicles that were in production and 4,000 finished cars. And the cost of that flood in South Africa in a Toyota factory was already exceeded $100 million for them. Because of that, they're also, I mean, not just because of that, but they're seeing these again and again. So the private sector is already starting to recognize. We did a survey as part of the report I'm talking about with BCG, where we interviewed about 300 large businesses around the world to understand how are they starting to factor in this element of risk in their work.
Yes, question from you, please.
Thank you, madam. My name is Madhav Karti. I come from Nepal. Madam Chair, I think you asked the panelist about the attitude of private sector in climate finance. And I didn't really get the answer. I think there are two elements here. I think private sector is still too profit oriented. That I think everybody agrees that. And second, I think private sector is too sensitive to losses and also are looking for de-risking support either from the public sector or from, I think, grant finance. So I think these are, and this is why I think still 2/3 of the climate finance goes to mitigation sector. I think green climate finance last data showed, I think, almost 65%. So my question is, when we know that in nature-based solutions, the financial economic rate of return is 1 to 3, and in fact, in mangrove, it is 1 to 5. I didn't hear anything about why private sector is not investing in nature-based solution to achieve adaptation goal. So that is quite attractive, and I would say that every data shows that currently the world is spending for every $1 spent on nature positive activities, $30 is spent on nature negative, nature destroying activities. So we coming from Himalayan countries, we have to strengthen nature to achieve resilience. I was really the last speaker when we talked about making infrastructure resilient. I think the better option would be sort of a hybrid solution integrating bioengineering and nature-based solution. And I come from IUCN. I also represent IFBES. So this was not mentioned by any of the. So my question is, why nature-based solution is not attracting, not changing the attitude of private sector? And my second question is, if we are really driven, if we are making decisions based on the economic financial return, but data, you are still not what we call evidence-based. There is no evidence-based decision making, even in, I think, in World Bank and ADB. The theme of this WSSD 2026 is transformative transformation. So
thank you. I think we.
Yeah, what transformation
got your
are
question.
you making in climate finance decisions?
Right.
Thank you.
So I'll ask Kanmani to respond to that, and then the wrap-up comments from the speakers.
Yeah. So one important thing I think others have mentioned in the panel is that the private sector not investing in adaptation is a misnomer. They do invest in adaptation. They might not call it adaptation. They invest in business continuity. Essentially, three kinds of things that they're doing is protecting their own assets. The second is helping people in the value chain, companies in the value chain and and distribution channels protect their assets. This is something that they can do more of, in the sense that this will reduce their business disruptions in the future and reduce their operational losses, but that's another big thing that they can do. The third is they are embedding adaptation in any forward-looking capital planning, so not putting up new assets in places that are potentially exposed to climate risk. And finally, the fourth is to Ms. Valerie's point, essentially thinking of adaptation not as a risk, but more as an opportunity. And essentially how they can serve or they can provide different adaptation solutions at lower cost to different communities.
Thank you. Now the one-line takeaway from our panelists in this order.
Adaptation is an opportunity agenda, and if we wanted to create jobs and GDP, we have to innovate how we invest, whether it's public sector or private sector, so that we have better and faster impact.
Thank you.
The world is actually not short of money. It's really a question of being smarter, being bolder, and tapping into the resources and redirecting and shifting.
I think resilient infrastructure is the opportunity.
Adaptation is about thriving and not just surviving in a changing climate.
Let's get real. Adaptation financing is not happening at the scale that it's required, and a lot needs to be done.
Amplification of any effort, the most important point is partnerships, bringing together governments, local or otherwise, technical expertise and financial innovation.
Linking community to global climate action. That's the key step going forward.
I think that's the good.
From you, Kanmani.
Solutions exist. Scaling up is the next big step. And because I'm the last and Mr. Benito didn't say anything, I'm going to also add innovation meets opportunity is probably the agenda to go with.
So let me pick up the key words from what our panelists have said as the final takeaway. We need to be smarter and bolder. We need to be thinking of thriving, not just surviving. We need to have collaborations. We need to get real on the whole issue of climate financing. And we need to treat adaptation financing not just as a risk, but actually as an opportunity. Thank you all, panelists. Thank you for the audience. This has been a wonderful session. And I'm very happy that we have kept to the time limit. So a big congratulations to all of us also for that. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, speakers and the moderator, for their valuable insight, and to all the delegates for being the part of this engaging discussion. We will begin with the next plenary session, focused on accelerating clean energy solution, here at 12. Till then, please enjoy the tea and coffee being served at the back in the hall. Please join the conversation using our official hashtags, that is WSDS 2026 and Act for Earth. We also invite you to visit the Terrace Zone at Shah Jahan Hall to experience Him Connect, Himalayan Innovation Mela, an initiative by Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, showcasing inspiring innovations from India's Himalayan region. Do take time to explore the partner and Terry stalls as well. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you all.
Across 40 countries. We don't just study the challenges of the future, we engineer the solutions that define it. This engineering mindset allows us to translate high-level science into the very policies that govern our world. For more than 5 decades, Terry has been the architect of policies bridging global ambition with national reality, from shaping NDCs to pioneering green budgeting. On the world stage, our World Sustainable Development Summit turns high-level discourse into measurable action. But for policy to succeed, it must be fueled by a fundamental shift in how we power our planet. At Terry, we bridge the gap between rigorous analysis and field reality to drive decarbonization. Our work transforms data into action. Over the years, the Program on Climate Change and Air Quality continues to work with MOEFCC on various projects and key negotiating strands in multilateral processes. Through precise source apportionment of air pollutants, localized climate projections, and custom flood modeling, we provide the evidence needed to build resilient environments. Through energy modeling and green hydrogen research, we are engineering a future with cleaner air. This mission is anchored by our new Center of Excellence on Energy Transition in Hyderabad, a strategic partnership supported by the Ministry of Power and BEE to catalyze national innovation. While we provide roadmaps for global giants, we remain committed to the last mile. Since 2008, our Lighting a Billion Lives initiative has evolved into LABL 2.0. In 2026, Lighting Livelihoods, equipping rural women to lead the solar revolution. This transition from fossil fuels to clean energy is not just a technological shift, it is a moral imperative.
In 1974, when Terry was founded, sustainability was a whisper on the global stage. Today, it's a roar. Our founding convictions remains. India's development must be balanced by ecological integrity. But as we face an era of unprecedented complexity, where energy security, air quality, and food systems are deeply intertwined, knowledge alone is no longer enough. At Terry, we believe that research must be a catalyst for change. Our mission is to confront the systemic issues, ploying society and transform rigorous science into adaptable steps. We study challenges. We translate research into actionable policy, deployable technology, and scalable solutions. By strengthening institutions and